Hey, what's going on everyone? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today, we're going to be replacing a trans cooler on a 2011 BMW 135i on the lift behind us. So, in the case of the 2011 135i on the lift behind us, the trans cooler has some external damage to it, which we believe is now a good time to go ahead and replace it. Generally speaking, these trans coolers are pretty robust. However, there are definitely some reasons why you might want to replace it. Number one being the thermostat here. These could go bad over time, which will cause the transmission not to operate at the correct temperature. This car is a dual clutch transmission, 7-speed DCT car, so great transmission, definitely needs to operate within a certain temperature range, so want to make sure that that is going to be functioning correctly. Past the physical damage on that, we are also going to be replacing one of the feed lines that feeds coolant to this cooler because it is a oil to water heat exchanger, along with another line that comes from the radiator to it, strictly because if any of these O-rings are in bad condition, it's not going to reseal, there's going to be a coolant leak, and you're going to have to end up doing the job anyway. So if you're replacing one of these coolers, it does make sense to replace the lines that feed and take coolant from it. Past that, we are going to have to disconnect the trans lines from the cooler. So we have some DCT fluid to refill the transmission, along with coolant to refill the cooling system, since we're going to have to drain it. Past that, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to do this job, and then we can go ahead and jump right into it. So some of the tools we're going to need to do this job: T20 and a T25 torque socket. You'll also need a T30 torque socket, 10 millimeter 3/8 drive sockets, which I'm going to have to use for the couplers on the cold side charge pipes. Magnet is always a good thing to have. This multi-angle pick for a lot of the quick disconnects. Flathead screwdriver for prying. Also, I'm going to be using one of these hose clamp pliers or hose pliers in order to manipulate some of the quick disconnect fittings to get them off. These channel locks for compressing one of the V-band clamps or clamps for the silicone coupler on the charge pipe. It's an aftermarket charge pipe. Along with that, your typical assortment of 1/4-inch ratchets. You don't really need anything big for this. Electric ratchet, and if you have access to a vacuum bleeder for the cooling system, that's going to be super useful at the end to verify that you have a system that is sealed and is not going to leak. Past that, these are tools we're going to need to do the job. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into it. So the first thing we're going to have to do is pull our fan out. To do that, I need the suction cowl here removed from the top of the engine. So this forward piece is held in with 4 T20 screws. So we'll go ahead and remove those now. Once the 4 T20s are out, I could pop these off, remove this, and that'll give us access to the top of the fan. The actual cooler itself is secured to the fan with a single T25 screw. So before we even try to pull the fan out, we're gonna have to lift the car up and disconnect the cooler from that. While we're still up here at the top, we can do a couple things in advance, such as unplugging the fan electrical connector. So I'll plop that off to the side. We will also release this expansion tank return line from the top of the fan, and then there's also a 10 millimeter screw down here that secures the fan to the radiator. Here's the T25 that secures the trans cooler to the fan shroud. We'll go ahead and remove that. Now we're going to go ahead and pull our fan assembly up and out. Very important to make sure that as it's coming out, it's not getting caught on like your expansion tank line or anything else. There's not a lot of room for this to come out either. It's really very, very tight fit. I'm going to go ahead and open up our expansion tank cap. This is going to allow the coolant to drain faster. Again, the trans cooler is an oil to water heat exchanger, so it uses engine coolant. And conveniently enough, the coolant line I'm going to be disconnecting to drain the cooling system goes to that cooler itself, because that is the lowest accessible point in the cooling system to be able to drain it from. So at this point, I'm going to lift the car back up, and I'll show you how to drain the coolant on the setup. So we're going to go ahead and drain coolant from The feed comes into the thermostat side of the trans cooler. And we're gonna pull this clip out. That will allow us to pull the hose off like so. And this line right here is attached to this larger plastic line, the one that we're gonna be replacing. Again, my reasoning for doing so is, yeah, we're pulling out the cooler itself, but the cooling system is sealed with these quick disconnects that have an O-ring on it. And I already know one of these, anytime you touch the trans cooler, it starts dripping immediately because the O-ring doesn't seat properly. So it doesn't really make any sense to go through this effort of, you know, having to refill the transmission and do all of this if you're just going to leave these factory coolant pieces back in, because you're just running the risk of having to redo it all over again if it doesn't reseal. I'm going to go ahead and release this other coolant line from the radiator. It's held on with a 10mm screw, because we're also going to be replacing that as well. Like I said, it does not make any sense to reuse any of these lines. The angle to get to this thing is kind of atrocious though, so using the end of a box end wrench. The charge pipe is in the way, that's mostly the problem. And as much as I would love to remove that to make my life easy, the charge pipe is also a difficulty within its own right. So we're gonna leave that in. Yeah, the screw is loose enough now that I can use a stick magnet to rotate the head of the screw, like so. So best way to explain it is it was already loose, so I was just using the end of the stick magnet to basically walk it. Kind of like what I'd be doing with my fingertips, but I just couldn't quite get my fingertips in there, so yeah. You use a magnet to unthread bolts or thread them in sometimes if there's a tight space. My little trick, it works. So go ahead and pull that hose out. So now we need to disconnect our trans cooler lines. So these are the oil-filled lines from the transmission. These are a two-pronged quick disconnect. So theoretically, I'm gonna use these hose pliers and I'm gonna use them to push down on the release. And then I'm just gonna walk it off. Now, these are plastic, so we need to exercise some level of caution while removing these couplers. So my recommendation to release these is to push it forward past the barb. I'm gonna use these pliers to push down on the release prongs so that I can walk it past the barb. There we go. It's one off. Now we're going to do the same thing for the other one below. Right there is the trans cooler. Yeah, so the cooler was hitting against the subframe, which caused that damage. It's pretty significant, so I'm sure there's some internal blockages. Who knows what else is going on in there. So there's absolutely no point to see this, ignore it, and not replace it. So this one, junk, throwing it right in the trash. While I'm working on the rest of the coolant lines, I want to make sure that the transmission is not open and fluid is dripping out. We do have to do a top-up procedure at the end of this, but I'm going to go ahead and hook on the cooler hoses in the same orientation that they were before. For them lock on. So now at least no transmission fluid is going to drip out while we're doing other work. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that hang for now. And we're going to work on removing that plastic coolant pipe. Honestly, while I'm still up here, I could see those torque screws that secure the pipe to the subframe. You can see them right there. Now is going to be a great time to go ahead and gain access to those. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen those screws and remove them now while I'm here at the top. No point working in the blind if we don't need to. The coolant pipe is secured with 3 T30 screws. Yeah, once these screws are loose, you pretty much have to unthread them with your fingers. There's not really much resistance on the threads. Now, we didn't really lose that much transmission fluid when we opened up the cooler, so I don't know how much it's going to require to top it back up. It may not actually require anything to top back up, but we'll do the fill procedure on that once everything is buttoned back up. There's not a ton of room just for you to see it, but there's another T30 here just to the right of the harmonic balancer. So in total, there's 3 of these T30s that secures this plastic pipe to the subframe. One of them is going to be over by the thrust arm bushing, but the plastic bracket that's normally part of the pipe is gone. So it's threaded into the subframe, but there's nothing, it's not securing anything. So we're going to have to remove the screw from the subframe no matter what, but that's okay. There we go. So like I said, the bracket, there's 3 mounting tabs on this coolant pipe. This one on this side at the subframe is broken, but the screw is still in the subframe. I need to get the screw out of the subframe so we can install the new one. Yeah, so the bracket on the car, or this piece, is missing from the hose. It's broken off. But the screw that's supposed to secure it to the subframe was all the way down into the subframe. So it was tight all the way out. Now we can go ahead and remove the rest of the hose. I'm gonna go ahead and disconnect this hose from the thermostat. Over here on the left side of the car, the driver's side of the car, if it's a left-hand drive vehicle. There we go. That has popped out, and I'm gonna go ahead and pull the quick disconnect out from this other hose. After that explosive release on the driver's side of the car, left side, we need to finally get to our last connection, which is the bottom of the expansion tank. Yes, the expansion tank feeds all of that. So one more quick release. So this is the expansion tank hose. So this is what connects to the expansion tank. This goes to the thermostat. This goes to the trans-cooler thermostat. And then this connects to, I believe, a heater core hose on the left side of the vehicle. It's a lot. Fortunately, the hose going back in is going to be a little bit easier than taking this thing out. Or not. Just using a little bit of antifreeze to lube the O-rings to make installation a little bit easier, and also to prevent any pinching when this goes to be reinstalled. I'm going to focus on the right side first, so expansion tank, thermostat connection. Once those are in place, I can hook up the trans cooler, and then we'll slide that heater core hose on the other side. There we go, first connection done. I'll go ahead and raise the car so I can start doing the connections from underneath. Particularly the connection at the thermostat, that one's a little bit tricky. Want to make sure that it actually locks in place. So one thing to consider, because this mounting bracket was broken off the original pipe, we didn't have to disconnect the cold side charge pipe from the intercooler. We do now though, because there's no way for this to clear that gap between the power steering pump subframe and the silicone coupler. So just things to keep in mind. Installation is not always the opposite of taking it apart. While I'm on this side and I could see the other hose and this is nice and loose and I have space, I'm gonna go ahead and click those together and make sure that locks in place. And now I'm gonna go ahead and re-secure the charge pipe. This obviously has an aftermarket setup on it. Your factory charge pipe's gonna have a quick disconnect on it. So installation of the factory part's gonna be different than what I'm doing for this one. That thermostat connection clicked into place. Did require a little bit of force. I was pushing on it from behind, but that has locked. I'm just gonna give it a quick pull. I've actually had one of these come loose before, and that's not a good time. So giving each one of these connections a quick tug to make sure that they're locked in place, but I think we're good on that front. So now I'm going to secure the coolant pipe to the subframe on the left side of the car here. That one screw that took a million years to come out, we'll go ahead and put that back in. And then we'll lower the car back down, then we can go ahead and install the other coolant hose to the radiator, hook up the cooler itself to the coolant lines, and then we'll fill the cooling system, do a vacuum bleed, make sure everything is good, that it's sealed up, and should be in a good point at this point. I'm feeling good about it. All right, so now that we have an actual mounting bracket over here on the left side, I'm gonna go ahead and install this screw, the one that took us forever to get out. All right, so at this point, we're just gonna go ahead and resecure the new coolant pipe back to the subframe. And again, all of this is to ensure that the connection at the transcooler doesn't have the possibility of leaking. One of those was already leaking anytime you touched it, anytime you moved it, which tells me the O-ring is not good in it. So it'd be really unfortunate to do all of this other work and then have this one coolant hose or transfer pipe or whatever you want to call it end up leaking, and then literally have to come back in here and redo all of it. So even though this is more work up front, I've kind of come to the acceptance that these couplers that, you know, BMW is known for using, Mercedes, Volkswagen, Audi use them now, I pretty much just treat them as a one-time use thing. For the radiator hoses, or the larger ones that have the larger O-rings, I'll take a look at those and I'll make the judgment call, but some of these smaller connections, they have more of a tendency to leak than the larger ones. So, you know, again, more time up front to do this, but nothing is worse than having to go back in and redo it because an O-ring is bad, or, you know, some connection is pinched. So what I could tell also, this particular coolant hose was also original to the car, so it's not a bad idea to replace it. So that is now secured. Now we have our new hose that plops into the radiator on this side. So yeah, the key here is to get that O-ring in first so it's seated. There are some stops on that plastic coupler right there, and then rotate it up against the radiator, and then that's secured with the 10mm screw. So I'm taking advantage of the fact that this car has silicone couplers on the charge pipe to get access so I can actually get this 10mm started, because, well, it was really brutal to remove, and that's not exactly going to help to get it started or even get it in. So at this point, that doesn't even make sense. So I'm just using the parts that are on the car to this advantage. Quite frankly, if this is a 135 and you're doing this job and you don't have silicone couplers on your charge pipe, probably want to just remove the charge pipe just to be able to get that one screw out, because there just isn't any room. Using antifreeze again to lubricate the O-ring, and then just gonna push it into place so that the quick disconnect locks. And it looks like, yeah, this has to be oriented or clocked. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and slide a radiator fan back into place. Just make sure that it clears the oil cooler lines as it's going down, and also the shape of the radiator cowl makes this a little bit dicey on this particular car. Another thing to mention, at least the aftermarket intercooler on this car, it's got some brackets on it and the fan likes to get caught up on it. So going back into position, you got to make sure that it's clearing all of that as it's going back down. And we got the little 10mm that secures the fan to the radiator. Now we just need to resecure the trans cooler back to the fan shroud with this T25 screw. There we go. So at this point, everything is resecured and hooked back up. I'm gonna go ahead and vacuum fill the cooling system. We do have a video on how to vacuum fill any vehicle using a vacuum filler, but these BMWs also have a self-bleeding procedure with the electric water pump. We have a tech tip video that shows about how to activate that system. So we're not gonna go over the fine details about how to fill the cooling system because there's plenty of content on that. I'm gonna still do this off camera. We'll probably have some B-roll footage of that. I'm just simply refill the cooling system, check for leaks, and then after that I need to start the car, let the transmission come up to temperature. As the transmission comes up to temperature, I just need to crack the fill plug, make sure that trans fluid is coming out of the fill level. That'll indicate to me that the transmission and the circuit is full. We didn't really lose that much trans oil when I opened up the trans cooler, so I don't think I'm gonna have to add any, but it is worth it to check. So I'm gonna go ahead and get busy and make sure everything is good to go. All right, so went ahead and buttoned everything else up. So, you know, fans back in, our suction cowls back in, obviously plugged the radiator fan back in, just made sure all those connections were good to go. Pulled vacuum on the cooling system, it held vacuum. Went ahead and filled it with about 1.5 gallons of coolant, which to be expected based on how much that we drained out of the system, just simply disconnecting stuff. So at this point, I'm gonna start the car. I'm gonna put the car up in the air, check for leaks, let it run. Just wanna make sure that everything is shored up underneath there. I'm also gonna check the trans temperature between 40 and 50 degrees Celsius. Wanna make sure everything's good on that, but we lost very, very little gear oil. Honestly, almost none. So I don't think it's really gonna need a top off, but it is worth checking. So once it's at temperature, I'll check that fill level and we'll be good to go. All right, so that's how you go about replacing the trans cooler on a 2011 BMW 135i with the DCT transmission. However, this process would be almost identical for any E82 or E88 1 Series with the automatic transmission. So your 2008 to 2010 135s or 2008 to 2013 135is, they all use the same trans cooler. Really not that many tools required for the job. The only thing that was tough was replacing that coolant feed pipe that sits on the subframe. But again, it's best to replace that while you're doing it because you really can't rely on those quick disconnect couplers or quick connection couplers ever resealing. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It'd be really unfortunate to replace the cooler, do all that work, and then find out you have a leak afterwards. So I went ahead and replaced both of the coolant lines that go to the cooler just to make sure that it's not gonna be a problem in the future. But I hope you learned a lot in this video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit that like button. And we always have a lot of videos on the way, as you know, so definitely want to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with what we have rolling out. And as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.